Entitled today's class last week before even knowing that we were going to be losing two major luminaries in our Jewish community. I had entitled it Haye, a celebration of life. And so I think that was Hashem's way of telling me that we cannot mope around and be miserable for what we've lost, but we have to appreciate what we had for the time that we had it. Rav David Feinstein, son of Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, he was a major luminary, a leading chacham and a posek. His doors were always open to the Sephardi community. If there were ever any questions, and the difficult ones are the ones that were brought to him, he always had his doors open with warmth and friendship. And we are very grateful that our world has had such a beautiful light and presence. Also this week, my teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi Dr. Lord Jonathan Sachs, Harav Yaakov Tzvi ben David Ariel Zichrono Livracha, also passed. And I want to offer my condolences publicly to his wife, Lady Elaine, to his children, Joshua, Gila, Dina. Rabbi Sachs was more than just a rabbi. He was more than just in any one place or in any one space at any time. His reach was so global and so far. His ideas were so open, and my entire view of Torah, I would say, was shaped by Rabbi Sachs. Maybe I'll tell you a tiny little background of myself. I went to Magen David Yeshiva, and then I graduated Flatbush High School, Yeshiva Flatbush High School, and I got married straight out of high school. I had a ring on my finger in my senior year, and that summer I was married. And back then, a nice Syrian girl didn't do both. Either you got married or you went to school. And Rabbi Besser is the one who told me, Vivien, you can't just sit home and cook dinners. You need to do something more. And he got me involved in tutoring for the BJE, actually. I didn't know the first thing about it, so I took out the books and started to prepare myself. Anyway, years later, about 20 years later, my mom came to me and she told me that she had been holding this secret and it's been weighing down on her all these years. Apparently, I had gotten a full paid scholarship to the Stern School for Girls, and it arrived in the mail because back then we didn't have internet and emailing like we do today. She took the letter and she hid it because she felt that she wanted me to continue on my path of being married and a wife and a mother, and she thought that that might deter me. And she came to ask Mechila and said, I'm so sorry, but I can't hold on to this any longer. And of course, I believe it's one of Hashem's ways. I was forced to open the books and learn by myself for all these years. And the voice, the predominant voice in my head has always been the writings of Rabbi Sachs. I'll tell you one more little story and then we'll move on. We always go around the table in my house and say, if you could meet any person that's alive, if you could have a 5-minute audience with somebody, who would it be? And it was always a joke. My kids always knew I used to say Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. That's my hero. He's my number one. And sure enough, a few years ago, I was fortunate enough, he came to Brooklyn and he spoke in our shul. He was the scholar residence at Bet Torah, and I was fortunate enough to be able to host him for lunch. And I have to say that I was so worried that it would be the person could never live up to in my mind, he was such a giant. I said he could never possibly, the reality can't be anywhere near, the image and the dream that I had of him. And sure enough, the whole week, I kept saying, I am Har Sinai, I am Har Sinai. I cannot believe that Torah is coming into my little humble home. And I till this day, thank Hashem for having the zechut of being able to host the rabbi and his wife. Um, I will tell you this, I had never experienced, I had always taught about Moshe Rabbeinu. He was the Anav Mikol Adam. I had never met in person this combination of a giant, a huge persona, but with the humility. I understand now what the words Tselem Elohim mean, to be in the image of God, to be in the shadow of God. God doesn't cast a shadow. God lets us shine. And if I have one takeaway from my meeting with Rabbi Sachs, it's that he never cast his shadow. He was like Tzelem Elohim. He was literally like the shadow of God, which doesn't overshadow anybody and just lets everybody else shine and brings out the best in everybody else. And so today I'd like to dedicate our class, Lilui Nishmato. I'm Birshut Morai V'Rabotai. I'm nowhere near worthy to say Torah in his name, but I'm going to do the best that I can, because one of the things that he taught all of us was that everybody has potential and everybody has a job to play and a role, and we can't just take in, but we have to bring out. And so I pray, Adonai Sefatai Tiftach, I pray that my words are in some way, his neshama is already in the highest place, I'm sure of it, but there's always where to go in the infinite. And so our learning today, with your permission, is going to be what I've learned from Rabbi Sachs. I kept it specific to the parasha because it's just, I'll say this, when you learn Torah from a person, they become like your father. They are supposed to be treated halachically and respected like a father. And my father always taught, if you give a man a fish, he eats for one day. He always used to say that if you teach a man to fish, he eats for life. Well, Rabbi Sachs, he didn't just give us a thought. He taught us how to think. And that education is something that I will carry with me for my lifetime. And just in case you're not familiar with his approach to life, I'm gonna just name some of his works so that we could get a sense of who he was. One of his works was entitled Universalizing Particularity. Just the title itself, universalizing, balancing the universal demands of our multicultural world, and at the same time balancing that with the particularism that Judaism demands. So already here, just with one title, you have a person who's a man of the world, but still at his core is steadfast to his Judaism. Another one is called Radical Responsibility. In one of his works, he talks about the responsibilities as they evolve in Sefer Bereshit. He starts with Adam Harishon, for instance, and he says that Adam Harishon, he needed to learn what personal responsibility was, how to be responsible for, literally, for your person. God asks him, Ayeka, where are you? Are you aware of your own responsibility to the self? And then he builds on it and he says that Cain came into the world and what he needed to teach or to learn was moral responsibility, responsibility for others. The Hashomer Achi Anochi, shouldn't be a question. It should be a statement. I am my brother's keeper. I have a moral obligation and a responsibility to my brother. And then he coined this phrase for me. I live by it. When Noah comes around, what was lacking there was this idea of collective responsibility. After I have my own personal responsibility and a responsibility for those closest to me, I also have a collective responsibility for humanity. And because Noah didn't negotiate with God and didn't try to challenge God to uh, defend or to preserve humanity, Noah isn't the one that the rest of humanity is going to learn from. And finally, we get today to Abraham. And Abraham is the one who has this human solidarity. He cares about everybody, not just his immediate family, his extended family, and then the world at large. He can't stand by and watch Sodom be destroyed, for instance. His reach was beyond. He literally lived up to his name of Hamon Goyim. He saw himself as the father of many nations. And I believe that this is what Rabbi Sachs, this is where he picks up. He wants to continue to hold that banner of having a solidarity with all of humanity. If you have the time, I strongly recommend to read any of his works. He quotes, whether it's presidents or prime ministers, thinkers, philosophers from Aristotle. He draws intellect from the entire world. There's no place that doesn't have some kind of light for us to learn from. And this was his gift to us. His gift to us was, I'll just add one last, my first book, I actually have it right here with me, and I opened it and it's inscribed by him, so now it's even more precious. The name of the book is The Dignity of Difference, for instance. These are ideas, these are philosophies. We move away from just embracing the self, and we just have a broader perspective. One of his main ideas is that the differences in each other is what we should be celebrating. It should not be the reason that we have friction. It should be the reason for peace, actually. And so, starting with this introduction, I'd like you to open your Chumashim to Parashat Haye Sarah. It's chapter 23 in Bereshit, and the parasha starts, Vayihiyu Haye Sarah, and the years of Sarah were 100 years and 20 years and 7 years were the years of the life of Sarah. I'm going to read one more verse. And she dies in Kiriat Arba, which is Hebron and Eretz Canaan, and Abraham comes to mourn her and to cry over her, to eulogize her and to grieve over her. I should start by saying that the parasha starts with the life of Sarah, and it ends with the death of Abraham. And rather than go first through the Sarah story, I'd like to start at the end of the parasha. I just wanted you to see how it starts. We didn't pick apart the Pesukim as we usually do, because I'd like you to go first to the end of Haye Sarah and see how the two events, so to speak, speak to each other. So in chapter 25, in the beginning of the parasha, he marries Keturah, who has all these children for him, and he gives everything that he has to Yitzchak in verse 5, and verse 6, he gifts to all his other children and sends them away. And now we have verse 7. I'd like to spend some time on this verse Ve'ele yemeh shene Haye Abraham. And these are the days of the years. With Sarah, we had these were this was the life, and we talk about the years. When it comes to Abraham, we speak about the days. Yemeh Shene Haye Abraham. It's a little bit bulky the way the Torah is describing the years of his life. Asher Chai, that he lived. We don't even need those words. Of course, if they're the years of his life, we know that they're the years that he lived. And he lived 175 years. I'm going to come back to that. I just want to take a few more verses. Verse 8 says, Vayigva. The word Vayigva is a beautiful word. It means he expired. It means there was no air left in his tires. There was no gas left in his tank, his teeth, everything, every part of his physical being was used to its full capacity. Vayigva Vayamot, since he used every physical component of his being, that was it. He exhausted it, maybe is a good word. Vayamot, he dies. And how does he die? It's one of the most beautiful deaths that's described in Torah. Beseva tova, at a ripe old age. Zaken vesaveya, of age and with satisfaction. Vaye'esaf el amav, and he was gathered unto his people. This is one of the most peaceful passings in all Torah, and it bears unpacking. So Rabbi Sachs says a beautiful thing, and he asks the question, and he says, how is it possible that Abraham's life is described as if every single day, Yemeh, the days of his life, every day was so fantastic? We know every day wasn't so fantastic. He went through 10 trials at the least. He gets to Canaan, there's a Rav, he goes to Egypt, his wife is kidnapped, he's fighting with his nephew, he has to save him from all kinds of places. He has traumatic experience with Akedat Yitzchak last week. His wives are fighting, he has to send one away. At the end of his, it's not an easy situation that Abraham went through, but yet they say he had a peaceful passing. And the worst part of his whole story, as we're reading this, I'm screaming inside and I'm saying, what do you mean? He has so many unfulfilled blessings. Where are all those children like the stars of the sky and the sand of the earth? Where is the land that God promised him? He doesn't have a space to bury his wife in the beginning of the Perashah. He has to go and literally beg the people to sell him a little plot of land so he could bury his wife. So he has all these unfulfilled blessings. How do you die peaceful with all of this unfinished business, with such a sense of things that are so unresolved? And I'd like to say that one of Rabbi Sachs' phrases, I was searching around my house before, I'm sure I'll find it somewhere. I used to print out his weekly Devar Torah. It was called Covenant and Conversation. I'm going so far back that I had to tell my husband, instead of bringing me flowers every week, just print out Rabbi Sachs's weekly lesson, because printers weren't so reliable back in the day. And every week I would read it, and he had this one tagline. That's why I was looking for it. Somewhere, I think he wrote it in his own script. He wrote, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, velo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. He may have just written Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. I was trying to look for it to find exactly how he had phrased it, but I think it speaks to Abraham's life. I think it speaks to Rabbi Sachs's life. I think it speaks to all of our lives. when we understand what this means, lo alecha hamlacha ligmod, we have to have a certain faith that we are not by ourselves in this story, that other people could continue what we begin, because Abraham didn't die with as many children as the stars in the sky, or he didn't see the fulfillment of the promise of the land in his lifetime. There's a sense of continuum that we are not alone in this world, that we don't operate exclusively of the rest of humanity. And the idea is, if we could believe that we are a part of a larger narrative, of a larger picture, and that other people will continue the work that we begin, then we can have some type of a peace in our hearts. We don't have to feel that we picked up every last, we left anything on the table, so to speak. And so he asks, so how do you do this? So he went through a lot of grief in his life, Abraham. He did. Let's go back now to the beginning of our parasha. He loses his wife in his lifetime. And for a man to lose a wife, his home is no longer his home. The wife is the one who makes the home. It was his life partner. They went through so much together. And he teaches us, Abraham Avinu teaches us, how do we pick up the pieces after we suffer a terrible loss? Well, you know what we said, and this is all, by the way, everything, I'm going to say it as often as I can remember to, but none of these ideas are my own novel original thoughts. This is all the teachings from Rabbi Sachs. And he says a very, very beautiful thing. He says how we respond to grief is going to determine whether or not we're going to find ourselves whole again, whether we're going to be able to move forward again. And the answer is right here in our parasha. In 2 verses, Sarah passes and Abraham eulogizes and mourns her. But now I'm back in verse 3 in the beginning of our parasha, chapter 23. It says, Vayakom Avraham me'al penei meto. It wasn't easy for him. He did have a person, his wife, who had passed away. But what does he do? He rises up from his grief. The big question is, he moves forward for sure, and he goes now moving here in lightning speed. He starts negotiating with the people, and he says, Ger v'toshav anochi imachem. I am a citizen, I am a resident, I am sort of a ger, I am I'm not 100% capable or eligible, because I'm a ger, to buy property, but please let me bury metimi lefanai. Let me bury my dead from before me. And the people of Haye tell him, we hear you, you're a prince amongst us. Please take from the greatest of our grave sites, and please bury your wife, no problem. But Abraham doesn't stop at this. In verse 7, Vayakom, again, this idea of rising up, of telling us that after you've been defeated, you don't have the right to just crawl into a hole or crawl under the covers or stay in a depressed mode. Vayakom Abraham vayishtachu. He rises up and he bows down to the people of Bnei Chet. And he speaks with them and he says, please, listen, I want you to get in touch with Ephron ben Sochar for me, so that he could give me Ma'arat HaMachpelah, which is in the center of his field, and I will pay for it its full price. And part of this, and rather than go through all of the negotiations and say that Ephron was a shyster, he made believe like he was going to give it to him for free, and of course he ended up commanding an exorbitant price for it. I'd like to talk about what Rabbi Sachs how he describes this. And he says, he uses the term, his mentors in moral courage. The ones who have mentored him to have moral courage are the Holocaust survivors. And he interviewed many of them and he spent time with many of them. And he found one common denominator amongst the survivors. And he said that the survivors, after the Holocaust, they found work, they married, they built families, they had children, they built their lives. And many of them went for maybe 40, if not 50 years without saying a single word, without talking about the horror and the traumas that they went through in the Holocaust. And he says that this taught him a very important lesson. He said, if you want to be able to move forward, you have to first build a future, and only then can you tell your story. Only then could you mourn the past. First, you have to create the future, and then you could mourn the past. What Avraham is doing here, and he's going to do it throughout the whole parasha, is, and the word livkota has that small chaf inside of it, in case anybody saw the kaf in the last word of the second verse. He cried, but his crying was limited. His crying was only contained so that he could start to build his future. What's his future? His future was two things. He has to acquire land. So he's going to start by buying Ma'arat HaMachpelah. He also has to ensure that his children are going to be like the stars of the sky. So he has to make sure that his son is going to get married. And one of the important things that we learn is that the people who have looked back before him, we're reading all of this in a certain context. We read about Noah, what happened to him. Noah went through a grief and went through a trauma. And he wasn't able, he probably replayed the scene in his mind 1,000 times after his entire generation died. And maybe he looked back and he was remorseful and he said, I could have, I should have, I would have, maybe I should have done this, I should have done that. And he stayed so stuck in the past. And how do we know that? Because he plants a vineyard and he drinks from the grapes, from the wine, in order to forget. You know, in his story, it has the word yayin 4 times. He, Noah, drinks to forget. We specifically have our 4 cups of wine, for instance, on our seder, because we drink to remember. There's a very big difference. And we can only remember once we've built our future. While we're in the thick of it, we can't be looking back. Who looks back while they're in the thick of it? Lot's wife. What does she do? She looks back. She's in a state of shock, for sure in a state of grief. And looking back, she turns to stone. She turns to salt. She turns to something that's unable to move anymore. Because if you're going to get stuck in the past, then it's going to own you. It's going to control you. It's going to hold you captive, says Rabbi Sachs. And Abraham decided he's going to set a new precedent. He doesn't want to be like Noah. He doesn't want to be trapped like the wife of Lot. And he says, first, let me build the future, then I could mourn the past. But it's impossible to move forward if we reverse the order. If we reverse the order, we're going to be stuck. And he quotes Viktor Frankl. I'm sure you've heard of him. He is a very, very famous psychotherapist. He was actually a psychotherapist while he was in the camps. And one of the things he did to keep himself and other people alive was he motivated them by saying, you have to ask yourself this question. When you're in a harsh, hard place, You have to ask yourself, what can I do in the future that only what's available for me to do that only I could do? Everybody was brought here. This is one of his big philosophies. No two people are the same because no two missions are the same. We all have a different mission in life. And he coached the people in the camp and he said, what haven't you done yet? What's that something that could help you survive the present, escape the past for sure, but survive the present so that you could move into the future? And Frankl built an entire school of psychotherapy, called it logotherapy. And logotherapy was really for people to find meaning in their lives, for people to be able to hear their calling, so to speak. It was the opposite of what Freud was teaching. What did we learn from Freud? Freud used to say, go into the back, go into your past, lie on the couch and tell me about your mother and your father and your whole life. The Mekubalim, the Kabbalists, call that playing with the snakes. They don't believe that the way to have a healthy future is by playing with all the snakes from your past and by going through all of your horror that you've experienced in your life over and over. That's not what's going to bring you to a place of health and future. So they believe that the future, in order to move forward, the future, I'm going to say it sounds silly, but the future is in the future. You have to hear your future calling you. Don't hear your past calling you. When you hear your past calling you, you're going to end up in a place of pain. But if you hear your future calling you, if people call a vocation a calling, or a mission a calling. We have to literally stop and try to hear how the future is calling to us. And of course, the future could be 1,000,000 miles away. But in the words, Rabbi Sachs quotes Lao Tzu, a Chinese sage, and he says, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. If we want to be able to hear the future calling us, we have to take it. We've heard these phrases, one day at a time. We have to take small steps. We have to open our mind, open our hearts, literally open our eyes and our ears. And there are no shortcuts. We know that what we gain easily, we know this from Yonah and his gourd, his kikayon, what grows overnight can easily wither overnight. So these things, these journeys of 1,000 miles, these hearings into the future, this calling and hearing the future calling us, the question is, what did Abraham hear that he was able to pick himself up? And I wrote this quote because this is Rabbi Sachs's quote. He said, the future will happen, but it is we, inspired, empowered, given strength by the promise, who must bring it about. What he is saying is that the future and the next step depends on us. We have to create the future and God will fill it with his spirit. And it was a very big philosophy of the rabbi that we all have a future not yet made. It awaits our making. He was one of the most prolific writers, I would say prophetic writers, and his writing was very, very poetic as well. One of the things that he says, and I think it really rings true today more than ever, and his truths were transcendent. They transcended place, they transcended time. This one truth, I'm going to actually read it for you in his words because he says it much better than I would paraphrase it. And he says, so much anger, hatred, and resentment of this world are brought on by people who are obsessed with the past and are unable to move on. He's saying that if you're going to take your past griefs and grievances and not move past them, there is no happy ending possible. Only more tears and misery. Again, the rabbi is here and he's taught us all. It's not about what God does for us. It's not about what society does for us. It's not about waiting around to have promises or hopes or dreams fulfilled from other people. It's the Kennedy saying, ask not what you could do, what your country could do for you, rather ask what you can do for your country. What Abraham's legacy is, if we had to put it in 2 words right now in this week's parasha, was the ability to move on, was the ability to move forward. And in this week's parasha, it happens to be that we see Yitzchak coming in from the field when he's about to meet his new bride. And the way that they describe his coming in from his field is, I have it here on in chapter 24, verse 63. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. And Yitzchak went out either to converse, lasuach could be from the word sicha, to have a conversation in the sadeh. He went lifnot erev, he went before the evening time, and he lifts up his eyes and he sees camels approaching. Yitzchak, what is he doing here? Most of the rabbis will say Yitzchak was praying, and he was the foundation for Tefillat Mincha. He was establishing Tefillat Mincha, which is said before the evening time. And if he established Tefillat Mincha, they say that Abraham is the one who establishes Tefillat Shacharit, that wake-up call, that fresh start. The legacy of being able to move on means every day, the way they describe Abraham at the end of his life, depicting every day waking up, every day saying Shacharit, and every day during the Shacharit, imagining that this is an opportunity to make a fresh start. What Yitzchak establishes when they use the word lasuach basadeh, that word siach or sicha, it's actually describing, I've very often cite Perek Shira. It's a book that we believe was written by King Solomon, where he gives voice to animate and inanimate objects, the sun, the moon, the wind, the water, the dogs, the rooster. Everybody has a sound and has a voice and has a message to deliver to the world. Well, the barley in Perek Shira is described, it's as if he gives a voice to the barley, and this is what the barley says. The barley says, Tefillah la'ani ki ya'atof. The barley is saying, my prayer is the prayer of the poor. We know that barley was the food that was given to the animals. It was the food for the poor man. And so if the barley could speak, the barley would say, my prayer is the prayer of the poor. And the poor is the one ki ya'atof. I learned this from my ladies. I think the word is shuk or shuckle, where you go like this and you sway back and forth. The poor person is the person who is swaying. He is in the wind, so to speak, being able to be blown any which way. And then it says these words, Velifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. And to God, he is going to spill out or pour out his sicho. What does sicho mean in this context? His conversation. So if Avraham is the morning shacharit, it starts to give us a sense of how we move forward. We wake up in the morning and this is life. Today's a new day. I'm going to have a bright start and, zippity doo dah, everything's going my way. And we start on our journey with our shacharit attitude. But very often, by the time we hit midday, reality sets in. And the reality sometimes is that we can't make it through the day alone. We have to come back and stop what we're doing and reconnect with God and recognize that we are vulnerable, that we are shaking and we are swaying and we are like a dust, so to speak, in the wind. And what do? Right here it tells us, Lifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. We can, exactly like Yitzchak did, we can converse. The word lasiach or sicha, a conversation, is a dialogue that we would have with somebody that we feel very close with somebody that's very familiar to us. I usually use as an example Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. Every step he takes, he's talking to God. He's saying, God, did you have to break my cow's leg? Did you have to, every piece he realizes that he's not in it alone, that he's in this story with God. And so part of this, what did Abraham leave us with? He didn't just leave us with the idea of you have to move on and you have to move forward and you're not alone and it's not your job to finish and the future is all part of your narrative. He gave us all of that, but he also gave us Yitzchak to tell us that as you're moving forward, don't forget, not only aren't you alone with the generations who are going to help complete your mission, but you're also not alone in your own personal mission. You are able to yishpoch sicho. If you're able to speak to God like Tevye did, if you're able to pour your soul out and have a conversation with God in every step that you take, then you will be able to continue to move forward. I'm going to give you another quote from Rabbi Sachs. He says, leaders see the destination, begin the journey, and leave behind them those who will continue it. That is enough to endow a life with immortality. And so it's not just enough for us to push ourselves forward, but we really have to put in place the ones who are going to continue after us. And if we can do that, then that's how we each build our own immortality. And when it comes to the establishment of the prayers, Rav Yossi ben Hanina says prayers were instituted by the patriarchs. Shacharit Avraham, Mincha Yitzchak, Arbit was Yaakov. We remember when he left Canaan and by the ladder, by the dream of the ladder. That's when he encountered God. And they even say Musaf could be with Yosef. And so they say that the patriarchs, they instituted the prayers. But Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says that the prayers are actually a replacement for the daily sacrifices. And so the prayers have more to do with the priest of the daily sacrifices than they have to do with the patriarchs. I'd like to say that the patriarchs, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they were presented to us as ordinary people with extraordinary gifts. They had the gift of being able to converse with Hashem. They were usually shepherds, like Moshe was a shepherd who also spoke to Hashem, but they were far from the cities and they were away from urban civilization. And what they offered us, the prayers of the patriarchs, offered us a spontaneity and offered us this idea that no two prayers were alike. In the words of Rabbi Sachs, They spoke from the depths of their being to the core, who is the depth of all being. And this idea that the prayer that's established by the patriarchs, we shouldn't lose this. We shouldn't lose this idea that it is something that is set aside and has to happen at a certain time. Prayer from its inception is something that comes, so to speak, from the heart. The priests, they offer something to the prayer as we know it today. They wore special robes, they wore special clothing, they were set apart, they were kadosh, but it was like clockwork. There was a set time and a set place, and it was a set ritual. The prayer as we know it today is sort of a combination of the two, because the spontaneity that we needed, it was essential for the patriarchs. It was actually disastrous for the priests. You couldn't just show up in shul whenever you want, and you can't just have a minyan and say whatever prayer. There has to be some kind of a structure. And so what we understand today is when we have our Amidah, it's the perfect balance between the two, between speaking to God and bringing sacrifice, between having the spirit with her, because all we're doing is reading words from a siddur as opposed to digging into our hearts. It's the personal dialogue of the soul combined with the collective worship of the nation. That's what our Amidah is. When we say the Amidah, we have the silent Amidah. That one represents the patriarchs. That comes from our heart, from our soul. We're invited, we're encouraged to include our own personal expressions to God in the silent Amidah. And then when we have the repetition of the Amidah, that would most likely represent what the priests offered for us, which was a more organized way of learning. I'd like to move a little forward in our parasha. Actually, we're going to move back a bit. We spoke about Yitzchak seeing and meeting with Rivka towards the end of chapter 24. I'd like to say that it's not Yitzchak alone who Abraham leaves us with. Abraham appoints to be his emissaries, to be the followers of his legacy. He appoints Rivka, or he sends his servant to find somebody, and this Eved brings us Rivka. And what he sees in Rivka is the prototype of Abraham. And I'll give you some points about that. When the emissary, they call him Eliezer, most of the commentaries say that that's who Abraham had sent. But when he comes and he first meets Rivka, what does she do? She is Vatama. She comes to him and she speaks to him and she says, Shte Adoni. Do you remember last week how Abraham had greeted his guests when he said, please Adonai? That's how he refers to them. She refers to her guests as Adoni as well. She sees the godliness in each and every one of the people that she begins to encounter. And so she says, please Adoni, vatem maher. And the way that Abraham was rushing, she is vatem maher over and over again. Vatarot, the way he ran to greet them, she runs to greet them. And all of a sudden, little by little, what happens with Rivka is that she becomes the Abraham persona, but in the female. So much so that when her parents don't want her, or they're hesitant to let her leave, all the way in verse 57, for instance, in chapter 24, actually, let's go to verse 56. They said, Vayomer alehem, Eliezer, or the messenger, says, Al te'acharu oti. We're in this fast-paced Mahari mode. Let's not put the brakes on. Al te'acharu oti. Don't slow me down. Hashem has already blessed this path. Please send me back and I will go back to my master, because they had wanted to wait either a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years until she gets a little bit older. And vayomru, and they say, and halacha exists from this verse, that before a woman marries somebody, she has to give her consent to the marriage. So they say, Nikra le'na'ara, let's call the na'ara, venish ala et piha, and let's ask her what she has to say about it. And all of a sudden now Rivka is put at the center of the stage. Vayikre'u le'Rivka, and they call to Rivka, and they ask her, Hatelchi im ha'ish hazeh, will you go with this man? Vatomer, she could have said a lot of things. She could have said can, but she says the word elech. She is now starting her own lech lecha. She is going to move forward. She is going to build a future. And she uses this word elech, and right away, Vayishalchu, they send Rivka, their sister, and her nursemaid with the servant of Abraham, and they bless Rivka. And so the blessing of Rivka is coming literally from her own family. And what do they tell her? At Haye le'alfe revava. You will be the mother of thousands. V'yirash zaracha et sha'ar sonav. And your enemies will inherit, and your children will inherit the gates of their enemies. And what happens is Rivka and her ne'arot, they do this very same thing that Abraham just did in our parasha. Vatakom Rivka v'na'aroteha. This word vatakom wasn't just used with Abraham. This word was used with the keved. When Abraham buys the field, it says Vayakom hasadeh v'hama'ara asher bo. Everything is standing up. Vayakom sedeh Ephron. The entire chapter is peppered with this word vayakom, to rise up, to rise to the occasion, to change our reality, to change our place, to change our space. When inanimate objects like Sedeh Ephron, when the Sadeh and the Me'ara could stand up, it's starting to show a cosmic shift in the world, that once we decide to either hear that calling or build that future or start to create our future, that God is going to come in here and even take inanimate objects and have them rise up as well. And so here with Rivka, she rises up. She doesn't just rise up physically, she rises to the task. She does rise up onto her camels, and she goes after the ish. She goes after the man. Even the Eved is being called an ish here. And this is one of the teachings of Rabbi Sachs, is that when we ourselves want to lift up a society, we have to lift ourselves up first. And when we see ourselves in a certain regard, we're able to see the godliness inside of everybody else. And so this Eved isn't just an Eved. He isn't just a servant who is coming to do his master's bidding. He's a man who has his own import, who has his own worthiness, so to speak. And it's at this point that suddenly she's able to come and meet with her husband. And to add to just to close that story, and then we'll come for an ending. When Yitzchak comes back from the field, what is it that he sees? He sees, we usually joke about it, that she sees him and he sees camels. But for today, I'd like to say that yes, he sees camels, but when Rivka in verse 64, Vatisa Rivka et eneha, when she lifts up her eyes and she sees Yitzchak, Vatipol me'al hagamal. I don't know why, but I'm seeing these words differently today than I ever did. I think Rivka becoming Avraham, I think she does more than just a clumsy fall from a camel. I think she realizes in her vatakom, in her state of elevated recognition of self, she realizes that she doesn't have to tower over, that she doesn't physically have to be above anybody in order to be elevated or exalted. She falls off of the camel, I think is a way for the Torah to tell us she doesn't need that elevation for her to be who she is. And she tells the Eved, who's this Ish that is going in the Sadeh, that is coming in to greet us? And the Eved says, he is my Adon. And she takes a Sa'if and she covers herself. They say it's a form of modesty. We believe that a Sa'if is something that they wore when they were going to be married. Like Tamar puts on a Sa'if. She thinks she's going to be marrying the youngest son of Yehuda, and the Eved tells the whole story of what happened. Yitzchak brings her to the ohel of his mother. He takes Rivka, she becomes his wife, he loves her, and he's comforted after his mother. There's a lot to be said here, but for the purposes of today's class, I'd like to suggest that much of what takes place in the Torah is here for us to understand the balances that exist in the world. For instance, I'm going to give you one more quote from Rabbi Sachs. He says, one of the greatest things in, let's just say, in American society, or I hope it continues to be one of the great things that we're known for, is the term we the people. And he says, a nation is strong when it cares for the weak. It becomes rich when it cares for the poor. And it becomes invulnerable when it cares about the vulnerable. I think this is what our parasha, the direction that our parasha is taking us in. It's telling us it's not all about the self. It's not all about the selfie. It's not all about our own. It starts with the self-esteem, but then we have to go out there and we have to be the Rivkas, the Ba'alat Cheseds of the world. We have to be strong and we have to feed the weak and we have to care for the poor. And we also have to allow people to cast their own shadows, to make their own mark in the world, not always feel that we have to, in order to protect my sense of self, I have to be the biggest person in the room. It's a tzimtzum, it's a sense of godliness to be able to retract, to shrink back, and to let other people shine. For me, this was one of the greatest attributes of Rabbi Sachs. He never made anybody feel that when they were in his presence, that they were anything other than a person in the image of God. And so I'll end with this. I didn't know why all day yesterday, rolling around in my head was the song from To Sir with Love, Sidney Poitier. I didn't know why until I realized Rabbi Sachs was knighted and he received the title Sir. And for some time he went by the title Sir Jonathan Sachs. And so I wrote a little something, and it just expresses my appreciation for the scholarship that I've gained and that the world has been fortunate. Those learning days of weaving tales, ancient and new, are gone. But in my mind, I know his scholarship lives on and on. But how do you thank someone for enlightening the world with our Torah? It isn't easy, but I'll try. He brought down from the sky universal truths, insights, and wisdom, so we'd soar 1,000 feet high. To Sir with love. The time has come to open books and in our minds confide. And as he leaves, we know we bid farewell to our most cherished guide, a friend who taught us right from wrong and weak from strong, with eloquence and charm. What can we give him in return? We can all be the moon as a star, reflect his light for all eternity, honor the godliness within each heart. To Sir with love. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and for allowing me to share these thoughts and ideas today. I hope and pray that his teachings live on and that you take the time and read some of the magnificent words that he has written for us. If anybody has anything that they would like to share, let me see, I could unmute you all.
Vivien, did you tell them about when Rabbi Sachs talked about the Stender?
He's talking, Vivien.
He was supposed to meet the Queen of England. Did you hear that?
Yes, I did. Hold on one second. I was supposed to make an announcement. Tanakh, wait, I'm going to mute everybody for 1 second. I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. Tanakh Study asked me to announce that Wednesday nights at 8. Oh, I am muted. Hold on. Unmute. You are muted by, you're unmuted by us. Okay. Tanakh Study asked me to announce that starting this Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. For the next 5 Wednesdays at 8:30 p.m., they are going to have up to each Sefer in Torah. And if you would like to sign up for those classes, you could go to tanakhstudy.com, TANACH study.com. I'm sorry about that. Yes, Gail, I know that why is this night different from all other nights? Is that what you were going to say?
So did you speak to Havina?
Yeah, I spoke to Vina and explained to her.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Vivien. It was
Beautiful,
beautiful.
Vivien.
Thank
It was
you.
lovely.
Have a
Beautiful,
beautiful, beautiful day.
Very special
always,
class.
honey.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful day,
Vivien,
darling.
you're
Bye.
great as always.
Beautiful.
Take care.
That comparison was amazing.
Thank you.
Somebody privately recommended. She's Rabbi Sachs is to come to her house.
You are extraordinary. I can't thank you enough for everything you put out there.
Oh, who is that? I'm hearing somebody's voice.
The whole cheer for him.
Oh, let me see. I could gallery view. Oh, I see
And I'm
everybody.
going to buy all of his books. And
Hi,
read
thank
all of
you.
them.
Thank
Yes. Hi, Yafa. Hi, Peggy.
Hi.
Hi,
This
Dina.
really hit home.
I
So special.
really, you know who I have to really thank is Esther Ruth. Are you in this class here? I don't know who you are, but somebody named Esther Ruth has been texting me. I was down in the dumps. I couldn't even open a book. And she picked me up and she said, Vivien, you can't, you know, you got to move forward. And she really gave me a pep talk. So I said, all right, you know what? If I know that I'm giving a class teaching his work, at least I could maybe try and put some thoughts together.
Leiluin Nishmato.
This was a very big loss for humanity, but Hashem gave us a gift and we have to be appreciative for the time that we did have him.
Amen.
All right.
Vivien,
Yes,
I-
Vina?
I just sent you a chat. What I said
Yes?
to you was,
What?
please send this poem to his family. They will really
You
try
are
to.
very funny this whole
Yeah, I
thing.
didn't know
First
if it
they
was
tell me they're gonna bring
inappropriate.
everything to
Sidney
them.
Poitier and the
And
rabbi,
they
I was a
said,
little
oh,
worried
It was
about it.
perfect.
and then they
No,
said
but
we're gonna come
it was
the first
min
3 days. They
hale,
don't show up
you know?
yesterday. We did whatever we did,
And
but they're
it was
very
min
busy.
hale.
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody take care of yourself. Hi, Amalia.
How it works is that.
This is my favorite part where you get to see who's here. Have a
I
beautiful,
can't wait
beautiful
till I
day.
can meet you in person.
We must.
Okay, what?
You
I
live in
have
New
some
York?
stuff here, but I don't
What?
want to be without
You live
anything
in
on
New
the
York,
days that you're
Bina?
not here. So I,
Flatbush.
Flatbush. Oh, so come anytime.
oh, okay.
God willing, we'll definitely see each other.
Well,
As soon
Okay.
as there's
Can't
no
now
wait
I'm
for
a
those
hermit,
times.
but after this is all
Okay.
over,
It usually comes in the mail. Let me see.
I
You know,
would-
and they
Take care, everybody.
Hi, Vivien.
bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
A good